folks, Josh Knight the First here with another episode of Writer Rewind, coming to you with episode 16 of the series. Let's get right into it. So this week on Kamen Rider Geo, we're getting to what seems to be the end of decades time in the show for the time being, but really a lot of what we're seeing in this episode is the setup for the next portion, the next arc in the series. Now we're going to be getting a lot of things answered, but really it's not. It's all just setup. A lot of it is just setup, and it left a little bit wanting in my taste. Now a lot of this is stuff that kind of seems no duh in retrospect, but for the time being, I'll just try to get through the episode and save my comments for the end. So to start with, we're dealing with this idea of telling Sougo, look, if you want to avoid this terrible future where you enslave humanity, you have to give up the belt and you have to do it now. So we see that Sougo is being told this multiple times by Geiz, also by himself, presumably in the future by Omagio. He tells him, look, if you want to eliminate me, technically you have to get rid of the belt, okay thanks bye, go back to 2018. Now as he's thinking about this, he's seriously considering it, because for what it's worth, Sougo's character has been presented to us as such, that he definitely does feel that he needs to do the things he wants to become king so that he can prevent that dream he had from ever happening. And from what we're told, he only has so long to decide to do so. Upon returning to 2018, he asks Tsukuyomi just how long it'll take before the Daimajins activate and take over the Earth, and apparently they've got a pretty large timeline of a few months. Now as far as dire circumstances are concerned, a few days usually would make things kind of more intense. You know, oh, I've got a few hours to defuse a bomb, or I've got a few days before a hostage is taken care of. This is more of a like Armageddon situation where you've got like 2 months before a meteor hits. Now for what it's worth, I do appreciate Sougo's characterization in this episode because he stays pretty consistent throughout. Upon seeing that Geiz is still fighting with Kasshin there in 2018, he decides that no, I'm going to do it right now, I'm going to prevent everything from happening, I'm giving up on being king, Geiz, destroy my belt, which he gladly does. Now the effects of the belt being destroyed are immediate, but should have been taken into account for anybody who was paying attention. Granted, nobody was around Omagio when he disappeared, but somebody would have been able to realize, hey, there's somebody missing from the timeline. But beyond that, we see two things that I think should have really stuck out to our main characters. One is that the Daimajins don't disappear, they just bury themselves into the ground, seemingly from where they came, and two, Kasshin doesn't disappear either, he just deactivates. Really, if the timeline had been affected, these things should fizzle out, Back to the Future style, but no, they're still physically there. Now apparently this is very okay for the plot because everybody seems to be okay with this. Omagio, before he disappeared, seemed to be fine with it, and then the Timejackers are very okay with this because they can keep moving on with their plans uninterrupted. Woz is okay because he still believes that the timeline will still take place the way he has it read out in his book, and Geiz seems to be satisfied that he's done his job there in the past. The only person that doesn't seem to be satisfied by this is Tsukasa, who apparently had his own plan going on, which we're just now finding out about, and he's trying to get that into place without letting the Timejackers know. Now whether or not this is actually trying to make him have a face turn and become a hero again, we don't know yet, because we don't get that much characterization out of him in this episode. Now getting back to the Timejackers, I do appreciate that their ideas are actually a lot more pragmatic. If they see that Sougo is still there, potentially he could still renege on his decision to not become king and put another wrench in their work. So they decide the best thing to do is to focus on killing Sougo and then continuing their plan. Now for sure, if they kill Sougo, if he is in fact Omagio, that would definitely change the timeline. And if you recall, that's initially what Geiz was trying to do when he showed up in 2018 to begin with, but we see here that he softened quite a bit on Sougo, and that's actually going to come more into play at the end of the episode. But for right now, I actually agree with the Timejackers. That plan actually makes the most sense out of anybody in this episode. Now to be fair, Sougo didn't take this decision lightly. One, he doesn't want to see anybody else getting hurt, much less get hurt by his hand in the future, but beyond that, he's had this idea in his head for many years now that he should become king. He is a king in his own mind. Now I do appreciate the little conversation that he has with his uncle about a dream deferred. Basically, if you give up on a dream, that can be fine for now, but you can eventually get back to it, which would be a nice lesson if it weren't for the fact that we know for a fact that he's going to get his powers back by the end of this episode. We see that the Timejackers have reprogrammed Kasshin to go ahead and go after Sougo Terminator style, but Woz is ready with a backup belt. It seems that he already had that ready since he had the first one ready to give to Sougo in the first place, but he figured at some point he's probably going to destroy his belt, I should bring spares. Now thankfully Tsukuyomi and Geiz were taking their sweet time getting back to 2068, so they see that Sougo is in peril and decide to help out. Now one of the things that I do appreciate again about Sougo's characterization in this episode is that he does something which harkens back to the Heisei vs. Showa movie, where he does does something that's very indicative of the Heisei riders, which is that he stands in the way of a blast that was shot by Kasshin, which could have effectively killed a kid that was right behind him. See, it's that idea of protecting life that seems to be the combined thing that all the Heisei riders have in common. They appreciate the value of human life. Much in the same way in that movie that Kota defended a flower from getting hurt during his fight with Kamen Rider Ichigo, the same thing happens here with Sougo defending the kid. We see that life is important no matter how small. Now that seems to have moved Geiz to decide, you know what, this is the thing that convinces me that he's not going to be the guy that I think he's going to become. So when the two of them are down and their backs are up against the wall, we see that Geiz makes the decision to hand over his belt over to Sougo, telling him, look, if you are the bad guy, I will take you out. I promise you, trust me. He's really appreciating that Sougo has made an effect on him, and he's determined to make sure that Sougo doesn't become Homicidal. Now this is very much in stark contrast with the way Woz has always been presenting the power, but here Sougo taking the power from Geiz means something completely different, and I'll talk about that more at the end, but really it reaffirms this idea of him as a protector, the more indicative idea of a Kamen Rider protecting other people from the evils of the world. Now during this fight, everybody does have a belt. Sougo eventually does take the spare belt from Woz and give it back to Geiz, so everybody's got a GQ driver again, and be sure to pick those up. They really want you to pick those up this episode. That was the thing that I was noticing. There's really a push for the toys here. There's a lot of close-up shots of the belt, and the extended fight with the time Majins really show that, hey, these things are kind of expensive, we need you to buy them, kids. Now during this fight, we do see Decade taking part, even though he doesn't know who he's even supposed to be fighting against. Again, I think that's kind of a meta thing from the writers, not exactly knowing what to do with him, but we see that he's using the wizard card to go ahead and become wizard form. Now one of the complaints I have, again, with the usage of his powers is the use of the final attack ride card. Now traditionally in his series, when he used a final attack ride card, that would, as the name implies, be the final attack of that particular rider, usually their rider kick. But here when he's using the final attack ride card, he's using just regular spells that Wizard would use in his series, like Bind or Big. Those aren't final attacks. If he was using an actual final attack, it should have been the Strike Wizard Rider Kick, but here it's just regular spells, so come on Toei, get with it. Remember your own terminology. We do see that the tide of the fight turns when Geiz gives the Exade Red Watch back to Geo, and by use of the Decade Ride Watch and the Exade Watch, he's able to become Mighty Brothers XX, which, because of that series from Exade, splits Sougo into two separate entities with two separate minds, but they're both still essentially him. And yes, again, this is a first quarter power-up, not a final form, so again, that's a misnomer. But with the Timejacker seemingly defeated, Decade decides this is the chance I need to go ahead and get out of here, so he's like, peace, I'll be back later. Eventually he might come back. I imagine he will, because they still have to wrap up why he was even there in the first place. But sure enough, the timeline seems to have repaired itself, or at least gone back to the point we were at the beginning of the episode. We see that the Daimajins down under the ground are activating again and lighting up, and Omagio has reappeared in 2068, almost counting on the fact that Sougo would receive the power again and become Geo. The biggest thing that we need to worry about in the plot is the fact that Woz seemingly has been waiting for all of this to happen and been anticipating it with bated breath, hoping for all of these things to fall into place just as his book says. And we see that next episode we're going to see a transformation from him into Kamen Rider Woz, and we're actually going to see another rider, Kamen Rider Shinobi. So yeah, that's the nuts and bolts of the episode. Let's go ahead and get into the analysis. So we see here that the timeline getting messed around with, really a lot of it wasn't messed around with, because certain things didn't really change. The only thing I believe actually would have changed anything would be if Sougo was in fact killed. But we see that things are still staying the same. Things are still static. We see that with a lot of the changes that the Timejackers have done, the changes have been almost immediate, and we see that right away. But here, we don't see anything disappearing like with the Timejackers taking away a rider's power. Here we see that things are still staying the same, meaning that it's all just an illusion. Nothing's actually being changed. And really, this is to someone's benefit. Who exactly, we don't know. We imagine that it's Omagio, but to a certain extent, I do believe that it's also Woz, whether he's working with him or working for his own personal gain. We're not sure yet, but that's basically what next week's episode is about. Now, as far as Decade's motivation and purpose in this episode, really, we don't know. It feels, again, like they just had to write him into the script because, yes, it's an anniversary series, and we have to have him say that line about a line and I'll be back because, yeah, we need more time for him to go do his own thing over with the Garo series, but again, we're gonna have to tie that up later because, yeah, we kind of set that up. It's basically Chekhov's gun for Kamen Rider. If you put Decade in the story in Act 1 as a bad guy, in Act 3 you have to bring him back and use him as a good guy. But because of that, this also draws into question the validity of Heisei Generations Forever, which of course just came out there in Japan, and whether or not it's canon to the series. Because if they're fighting alongside the Riders in that movie and we see all 20 of them on the field, technically they should know whether or not Decade's a good guy. But here in the episode we see that Geiz doesn't ever refer to him as Decade, he only calls him by his name, Kaduya Tsukasa, so shouldn't he know about that if the movie was in fact canon? Now definitely the highlight of the episode would be Sougo and his motivation, the very distinct difference between Woz giving him his powers and Geiz giving him his powers. So the big thing here is that Woz has always presented it to him as power. You will receive power when you take this belt. That's what you want, power. Versus when Geiz gives him the belt, like, no, you take this because it's a responsibility to protect people. This is for other people, not for you. In that sense, it may actually legitimize Sougo as a writer a little bit more in my mind, but he might still have a bit more to go since we still think that he's still got a lot to learn. He's still quite naive for a writer. He's not necessarily Ryuki levels of naive, but he's got some growing up to do. But those of course are my thoughts on the episode. I want to hear what you guys thought in the comments below, so let's go ahead and talk about a few things. First off, the things from the future that didn't disappear in this episode. How is it that Sougo, Tsukuyomi, and Geiz didn't notice that the Daimajins or Kasshin didn't disappear when the belt was destroyed, when technically, if the timeline had been changed, they should have disappeared? Secondly, Sougo as a writer. Do you believe after this episode, since he has protected an innocent life, is he more on the path to becoming a Kamen Rider in your minds, or does he still have more to go before he can fully prove himself and have shown that he's earned the title of Kamen Rider? And third, because of Geiz having renewed faith and focus on Sougo not becoming Omagio, do you believe that it's actually Geiz who's the key to victory here, and not Sougo in making sure that Omagio never takes over the future? You tell me in the comments below. And of course, during the week, you can always talk to me over on social media. On Twitter, I'm at JoshKnight1st. This has been episode 16 of Rider Rebuild for episode 16 of Kamen Rider Geo, Forever King 2018. I'm Josh Knight the First. I'll see you guys again next episode.